All right, we had just begun talking about Paleo Indians. Paleo coming from a Greek word meaning ancient. So essentially, the forerunners or ancestors of American Indians or Native Americans. Those first folks who came into the Americas at the end of the last ice age. At the very end of it, circa 12,000 BCE to roughly 8,000 BCE. Now, these dates are approximate; they're give or take, roughly, 2,000 or 3,000 years or longer. Different sources might have slightly different beginning and ending dates, but this is roughly what we're talking about. The end of the Ice Age till roughly about 8,000 BCE, or 10,000 years ago or so. Now, the Paleo Indians were true nomads. Of course, we don't know what they may have called themselves. They ranged all over the Americas during that time period. We do know that they traveled in small bands, usually extended members of the same family, so maybe 20 people, sometimes as many as maybe 50 or 60 people, traveling in pursuit of wild game without having permanent habitations, without building permanent houses, without having fixed places of abode, without having permanent ritual or ceremony sites or cemeteries, which they regularly buried their dead in. It was much more likely that your deceased members of your immediate family might be hundreds of miles apart, because these bands could travel a couple of hundred miles a year easily, if not more. And the game that they pursued at this time, known as Megafauna, mega meaning mega, great big animals that existed in North America at that time. Things like the woolly rhinoceros, the giant sloth, saber-toothed tiger, things like the mastodons. And you'll notice in this particular picture there's some horses in the background, much larger than modern horses. They did exist in North America thousands and thousands of years ago, but became extinct a very long time ago. So they were really only known, if known at all, in subsequent centuries and millennia, as sort of distant stories that may have been passed on. So these different types of animals, of course, we no longer have with us today, many of them, and we'll talk about why a little bit later. Here are several different variants of bison, frequently commonly called buffalo, although technically they're not buffalo. That's a different kind of animal, but I will use the word buffalo, meaning either meaning bison, right? Sometimes I'll say bison. So if you look at these different variations, on the far right, you've got bison, which is the modern bison or buffalo. As you can see, these other kinds were larger in size, much larger in size than the modern buffalo, which, as you could imagine, would make it harder to hunt them. Now, the Paleo Indians during this time period did hunt bison and some of these other large animals, and they did so using mostly spears. You'd have to probably not going to bring one of these big animals down by yourself. It would be a group of hunters. And another tool that was used was the Atlatl, or a spear thrower. This also existed at roughly the same time, or maybe a little bit earlier, in Europe among the Paleolithic people there. So the way this works is essentially you've got this handle that you notch a short spear into. Sometimes those spears would be feathered like an arrow to make them travel straighter and faster. And essentially, when you've got this extra stick that you throw the spear from, it's like, if you notice the image in the middle on the upper image there in succession of the guy using this thing, it gives you like an extra joint in your arm to add more of a snap, right? More force to the spear that you're throwing using this stick, so that it travels much, much faster and has much more impact than any spear could have that was just thrown by hand. Atlatls, which are still used competitively. There are places you can go watch people using these things in competitions. They can hurl these little spears anywhere from 60 to 80 miles an hour. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century and met the Aztecs on not so good terms, they discovered that Aztecs, who used atlatls among other weapons, that these atlatls could hurl those spears so fast and so hard that they would go right through metal armor. So this was a pretty significant development, and pretty significant toward the bringing down of the very large animals that people were hunting. Now, the spear points that were used kind of differed over time. The most well-known, archaeologically speaking, that maybe some non-archaeologists would recognize are the different points, the Clovis point, the Folsom point, and some people might recognize the Plano point. The Clovis point there on the left, double fluted, it's sharp along both edges. The Clovis and Folsom points both had long grooves in the middle so that you could fit this thing onto the end of the handle, the shaft, right? And then tie it and secure it real well. Clovis was used roughly, you can see the time period there, to bring down mammoths, mastodons, and so forth. A little bit later on, a couple of thousand years after that, the Folsom point, smaller and thinner than the Clovis point, primarily probably used on bison, probably used in the plains. Now, both of these different types of points, they're not named after a group of people. There was not a Clovis tribe. They're named after the modern towns near which they were first found. The Plano point, which came along a little bit later than the others, was interesting in that this is what was used on the plains. All these actually were used on the Great Plains. The Plano point was not fluted. It was not specially made so it could fit securely on a shaft. It was actually less complex than the types of spearheads that had been used before. So why were they taking a step backwards? Part of the reason may be that they were no longer relying exclusively on spears to catch the bison, to kill the bison that they were after, that they had found other strategies such as stampeding or corralling. So here's a couple of images. One shows the use of fire, and this is being used for hunting. So there were controlled burns that the native people would use so as to sort of strategically place these fires so they're burning toward a herd of buffalo that will then force the buffalo to run in the other direction. Corralling is when you get them to run into a canyon, a box canyon, where they're now stuck and they can't get out, and then everybody rushes in with their spears and stabs them. Stampeding is where you chase them, and in their fear and panic, they run right over the edge of a cliff where you've got people waiting for them at the bottom. Sometimes the fall would kill them. Sometimes it would severely injure them, making it easy for people with the spears to come in and finish them off and carve them up and carry home as much of the meat as they could. So this was still being used in the historical era after European contact, and was observed by explorers and other Europeans and Euro-Americans who came along afterwards. So here is another map similar to the ones that we saw before, with that ice-free corridor in Canada, with the speculated potential migration route. Of course, as we discussed earlier, that may have been so and it may not have been, but it shows you where Folsom and Clovis locations are, where these things were first found. And we also have these, again, approximate dates. Now, we also know that there were certain areas that as long ago as the Paleo Indian era were being mined to get the right kind of rocks to use to make spear points. Now, arrows, bows and arrows had not been invented yet. It was going to be a long time before they got invented in the Western Hemisphere. So, because, as I said, these bands were truly nomadic, they might take them, who knows, it might take them 3 or 4 years to complete a circuit of their wandering before they came around to the same area again. But they took note of where the good resources were, and several of these mining sites, you would see probably Paleo Indian bands come through here and take as much of the stone as they needed to make their tools and weapons, and then maybe a few years later come back through again and stock up again. In the meanwhile, perhaps having gone to some of these other sites. Alabates, a type of flint that was particularly probably prized, and we know that because of some later burial grave contents, probably particularly prized because of its red color, which makes one believe that possibly the color red was believed to have special power. It wasn't just a matter of being pretty. So maybe because it's the color of blood, that might be prized to use as a spear point, because it was symbolic, or perhaps even believed to be beyond symbolic, but to actually help in killing the prey that they were after. The period from roughly 8,000 to 5,000 BCE, or in other words, 7 to 10,000 years ago, is called sometimes the Altithermal Age, or the Climatic Optimum, or the Watershed Age. It was a time during which the temperature rose once more. Now you can look at this chart here and see that 12,000 years ago, it was pretty doggone cold. And then pretty quickly it warmed up significantly by 10,000 years ago. But then for a couple of thousand years, it remained fairly steady. And then 8,000 years ago, it shot back up again, significantly warmer than the climate is now. And that lasted for a couple of thousand years. Now, when that was happening, the northern hemisphere in the summer became a few degrees warmer on the average than it had been. Some areas in the southern hemisphere got colder, so it kind of balanced out that way. But it didn't really balance out in the north because this means even more ice melted. So with even more ice melting, the water is going to go somewhere, obviously. And so a lot of lakes and rivers were formed from the melting ice. But at the same time that was happening, because it had gotten significantly warmer, that led to some climate changes. It made the southwest, there in red, become extremely arid, desert-like. And then the orange areas, which includes the plains, a large part of the plains, became extremely dry. So hot and dry. As a result of that, the human population in the plains area started to decline because it was getting harder to get by. It's drier. So many of the nomadic peoples who had been sort of wandering in that area just wandered off somewhere else, somewhere more promising. Those who remained went from being pure hunters, hunting megafauna as they had been, as their ancestors had been, to hunter-gatherers because game was declining. In fact, it declined so significantly that many of those species we discussed earlier, those giant animals, became extinct. Now, that was partly because of the change in climate, made it harder for those animals to survive, and because it was making it harder for the people to survive, they killed more animals of the smaller number that was left. So overhunting also probably contributed to what is called the Pleistocene overkill, which led to the extinction of many of these species. Well, another thing to discuss about people in that time period, these Paleo Indians, is burial practices, and I've kind of touched on that before when I said they didn't have any permanent habitations. So when they did bury somebody, they tended to do it close by where they died, and that was when they were on the road, right? Because probably these bands would move every few days. Initially, we were looking at burial, sometimes cremation of bodies, but it wasn't necessarily everybody. Special people like shamans or maybe leaders received burials, and sometimes sacrifice victims or people that they'd killed and sacrificed from other bands, which is where they would get their sacrifices probably when they did choose to try to appease the heavens by spilling human blood, would be ceremonially buried. However, over time, you started to see more elaborate burial rituals. And one example of that is in Montana, in southern Montana, the Anzic site, where in 1968, this site was discovered near a river. There the arrow is pointing to where the site is. And they found actually 3 small children buried there. They thought they were all from the same time period, and they thought they were all from the Clovis period because there were Clovis points found with them, at least with one of them, making that the very first human remains discovered from the Clovis era. But it turns out that the child with the Clovis points, and he had quite a few of them, was a couple of thousand years older than the others, which still means the others were thousands of years old. But this particular child, Clovis Boy, as he is called, had buried with him a bunch of stone tools, about 115 stone tools that he could perhaps use in the afterlife. And many of them were dyed with red ochre. So we talked about how, those certain types of flint that were naturally red were prized. Well, when those weren't available, apparently, they would use dye to make their spear tips red, perhaps for the same reason, signifying blood and hoping success in the hunt. Now, another thing that was discovered with the boy, along with all these tools, was a pair of antlers. And turns out those antlers were hundreds of years old when they were buried with the boy, which indicates that perhaps the antlers had been used down through generations for ceremonial purposes of some kind, and were laid to rest as some special talisman with this boy. And by the way, the genetic testing that they did indicated a close relation with people in Siberia, but also genetic markers that make Clovis Boy related to about 80% of modern Native Americans, which means, probably the ones he's not related to are those who came in those later waves, like the Athabascans that we talked about. Now, another significant gravesite, a little bit more recent, only 9,000 years ago, so that was after the Clovis period, in Texas, known as Horn Shelter Men. They found this circular grave with two bodies inside it, and it turned out to be a 40-year-old man and a child that was 10 or 12 years old. They were unable to determine the sex of the child from the remains that were left, but it is conjectured that because this man got a special burial, that he must have been a shaman, and a lot of the items buried with him and the boy help point toward that. There were bowls and pestles for mixing stuff up. There were antlers. There's a tattoo kit, several cleanly broken needles. And the reason that's important, these needles were used probably for tattooing. They weren't old, worn-out needles. They had been specifically broken to place into this grave, rendered useless perhaps to grave robbers, so that they could be carried into the afterlife, along with all this other stuff, including a hawk talon that had been placed in the man's mouth. So there's all this ceremonial, ritualistic stuff going along with the burial. And since the child was a young child that also was there with all this stuff, it's conjectured that perhaps that was his apprentice that he was training to become a shaman in his place, which of course presents the question, did they both happen to die at the same time, perhaps of some disease or an animal attack or an accident? Or was the boy placed in here prematurely, sort of like those needles were broken, so he can continue his service to the shaman in the afterlife? So far as I know, there's no way of telling which way that went. Shortly after this, and by shortly I mean only a millennium, only about 1,000 years, we saw the beginning of a new categorized period called the Archaic period, which is what North American archaeologists use to describe the time from roughly 8,000 BCE to about 1,000 BCE. So that's about a 7,000 year period, known as the Archaic period. So next time we will talk about what sets that period apart from the prior Paleo Indian culture that had been in existence up to that time.